Tonight, another parable. This one is going to be in Matthew 13, starting in verse 31. The parable of the mustard seed and the parable of the leaven. We'll just read that short section there, 31 through 33.
Can we do the week?
Yeah, we did that one the last time.
Oh, I wasn't here.
Yeah, you missed out. You missed out, Jill.
I got through it because I wasn't here.
Oh, yeah. Well, I don't know about that. Starting in verse 31, he told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed, which a man took and planted in his field. Though it is the smallest of all your seeds, yet when it grows, it is the largest of garden plants and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and perch on its branches. He then told them still another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and mixed into a large amount of flour until it worked all through the dough. I think some versions say 3 parts of meal, I think, or something, when it talks about the flour and that. Basically, it's talking about yeast or leaven and how it mixes with the flour, and it'll go throughout the whole. But I know in the past have often wondered why they would select these, especially the mustard seed. Now, is the mustard seed the smallest of seeds?
Pretty small, like microscopic.
Yeah, but it's not the smallest one. I mean, I used to question, I thought, well, there's other seeds that are smaller than the mustard seed. But what was it? It was the orchid, I think. Yes, the orchid. The orchid is actually the smallest seed in the world. And it is about the size of a grain of dust. That's pretty small. But a lot of people will say, well, he's wrong here. That's not the smallest seed. But in this time and in this region, this is the seeds that they had to work with. In that region, the mustard seed was the smallest one. And it was one that they could plant, and when it did grow, I don't know if anybody here has ever grown mustard or not, but it doesn't get that big. But in that region, once again, it can get as high as 10 foot tall. And then as it dries out, of course it's not like a tree. I mean, it says it is like one, but it's not necessarily like a tree, but when it dries out, it has branches that would be stiff enough for birds to perch on. So when he's talking the parable, sometimes we can take things maybe a little too literally and say, well, I don't know, mustard seed's not the smallest seed that I know of. But I think when we have the thoughts of he's talking to these people at this time and knowing what they know. They didn't know that an orchid had the smallest seed. They didn't plant orchids over there. They had no idea. But what they did know was that the mustard seed, most of the farmers there knew that was the smallest one. They were used to wheat, corn, other grains. Big seed compared to a mustard seed. So it grew into it, as it said, it grew into a tree, which, it's not really a tree, but as it would dry out, it was capable of sustaining birds on the branches of it. When we look at the seed, once again, we're going to kind of throw back to the other parables. What has to happen to the seed before it germinates, before it sprouts? It has to be what? Has to be sown, doesn't it? I mean, it's the bottom line. I mean, he's talking about, it's like a mustard seed which a man took and planted in his field. So the seed has to be sown in order for it to do any good. As it says there in the second part there, when it talks about the leaven has to be mixed with the flour for it to do any good, doesn't it? Just sitting there, I mean, we have a jar of yeast that's in our refrigerator. Sitting in that jar, it's doing nothing, is it? It has to be mixed with flour. It has to be mixed with your dough in order for that yeast to do what it's supposed to be doing. When we go out and plant the seed, and of course it's talking about this is like the kingdom of heaven. How is the kingdom of heaven like a small seed that is planted and then it grows?
Started out
Huge.
small.
It started out small. How did it start out? How did the kingdom of heaven start out?
In Jerusalem.
In Jerusalem on the day of Pentecost, there was how many apostles? How many people in the crowd? It started out with very few people, didn't it? And by the end of Peter's sermon, how many were baptized? 3,000. About 3,000 were baptized. Later on in Acts, how many more were added? 5,000? How is that compared to what he's saying in the parable? Tiny mustard seed. If it's planted, what can it do? It can grow. It can produce. It can get to the point where it's a large plant that we could actually go back and look in Isaiah 53 where it speaks. Isaiah 11, where it speaks of a rod or a shoot that would come out of the stem of Jesse. And it was a branch that would grow out of its roots. That we know is in reference to Christ. And isn't that the same thing that is being predicted? That just a small seed, Jesus started it. His kingdom grew then to a point of where we are today. Now we could take that to narrow that down to this community. We're probably a small seed in this community. We're not the majority here. I know when we went to Texas, Marble Falls and Bertram, Texas, when we were with them, we were amazed that when we would go into the town, practically every business, 70% of the people you meet on the street were members of the church. And we think, that's kind of unusual. Well, there it's kind of common. They own businesses, they work, they're members of church. You see them on Sunday, and you're going to see them on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. How is that here? We're in a remote area. We're a small congregation. Can we make a difference? Even though there's a large field out there that needs to be sown in, can we make a difference? Do we sometimes feel like we're so small, we need a lot of help? But do we really? Remember what he said in Matthew about having the faith the size of what? A mustard seed? And what can we do if we have just that much faith? Anything. We can move mountains. We would be able to do that, wouldn't we? If we truly had that amount of faith. Which in reality is not that much when he's making the comparison. And yet, I think sometimes we get a little overwhelmed when we think, well, what difference can we make? What difference is one tiny mustard seed in the ground? And yet when you see it at full maturity, you see a large plant that birds are perching on. We can make the same difference. Joe.
I think something that kind of made an impression on me is the story of the eunuch. And he was reading from Isaiah, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Well, then Philip talked to him and the gospel, and then the eunuch went on his way.
Right.
So we don't know what from that point on, what his life was like.
Right.
And how many seeds he sowed. So we have to look at it as if we can just plant that seed,
Right.
And somebody else comes along and waters it. So there might be people in this community that may not are here, they may be someplace else, but
Right.
you never know. Just talking to people about it, you don't know how far that can go.
Right.
We may not see it, all of it.
Right. Yeah, and that's the thing. We're told in Matthew 28 to what? Go into all the world. I mean, he told us that's what we're to do. Go into all the world. We're to be planting that seed. Planting the good seed, the gospel. Whether we see the fruits of our labors or not, it doesn't say, does it? That we're going to see. Every seed that we planted, we're going to see it sprout, we're going to see it grow, we're going to see birds in it. It doesn't say that. It just says, go out and plant. And go into all the world. Now, some people think that going into all the world means that we have to go to a foreign country or something to make that work. In some ways, probably it is easier because they may not have as much influence there. They may be, the ground may be more fertile. But what about right here close to home? What about our neighbors? People that we see every week if we're in town, but we really don't know them that well. Andrew.
Kind of along those lines, as we think about the comparison of how tiny the mustard seed was, yet the sower put it in the ground anyway.
Yep.
Sometimes we can think little of our own ability or influence and think, oh, they wouldn't listen to me.
Right.
Look how worldly they are, or their disdain for God. They would never listen to me.
Right.
And or I just don't have the ability to talk to them. I can't do that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, he's saying, go ahead and do it. Go ahead and plant that seed anyway.
Exactly.
And see what happens.
Mm-hmm.
Because that person who you may think is so worldly might spin around to be on fire for the Lord.
Mm-hmm.
Because they recognize what they have.
Right.
So don't be afraid. Don't think of so little of yourself that you're afraid to plant the seed.
Right. And that's the thing. I think we do think a lot less of our abilities than really what they are. Because we all, if we claim to be a Christian, if we have been baptized into Christ, we have a story to tell on that, don't we? And that's really all we have to do is tell that story. Because that is the gospel, isn't it? How we became a Christian, isn't that the gospel? Lane.
I think sometimes we also like to judge the soil for ourselves a little bit and think, well, there's no point in planting seed here. Let's just move on.
Mm-hmm. And that can be a common thing. It's kind of like what Andrew said. They're too worldly. They'll never listen. There's too many weeds, too many rocks there. Why waste my time? think about, why would Jesus waste his time with me? I was there. I was worldly. Why'd he waste his time with me? Roger, Jill, Gene.
So part of the message of the mustard seed is the proportionality of that seed compared to the growth of that bush.
Right.
That's the church, it's just, it's unimaginable how, a small seed of the church can grow way bigger than, I think, proportionally to the mustard seed, but.
Right. But he's giving a good analogy though, isn't he? He's giving something that these farmers, these people at this time, they knew. They knew that that little seed, yes, if we put that in the ground, it grows big. Birds light on it. He's making that comparison. This is like the kingdom of heaven. This is how it will start. It will start, one man came to earth that was sinless. He taught his disciples. They went and spread the word on the day of Pentecost to the people. It went from those 12 to 3,000 to an additional 5,000 to they went out of the city and into all the area around. Look how big it went.
Yeah, I'm not sure, but I think one of those passages talks specifically there were 3,000 or 5,000 men, so those were
Exactly.
households, so it was really bigger than
Exactly.
the number. Is it 3,000 or 5,000?
Well, one of them, well, the first one is 3,000 at the day of Pentecost, and then the later, and I think that one says men,
Yeah.
or maybe it says souls.
That was a priest.
Yeah.
A bunch of priests.
So, it was a lot. And just look at that, the branch, like it was referring to in Isaiah 11, the branches, the stem, and the branches. The more branches there is, the further out it goes. Jill.
Well, you think about, if you look at God's word, it's small in appearance, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
When you look at God's word, but it has incredible transformation. It can transfer power. The power can be huge.
Mm-hmm.
This is big.
Right.
But when if you pick it up and look at it.
Yeah, it's just another book to some people,
What
but
goes from here is, the transformation is huge.
right. But what it has, the potential, and that's what we're talking about, the potential of that little seed and what it's able to do. Gene.
On the lines of what Lane's talking about, sometimes you might think, what's the use? And other times I think it's we're excited, we believe, but it's the fear of rejection that you put it out there and they shut you down. And
Yep.
sometimes I think we're just afraid of the rejection.
Right. Yeah, nobody wants to be rejected, do they?
No.
I mean, nobody wants to be put down like, well, you Jesus freaks, I mean, it's happened. It's happened. And nobody likes that. So in turn, you think, well, kind of like what Lane said, we'll kind of judge, I kind of know what their type is like, and I don't think I want to present it to them because they're probably going to come back with some sarcastic remark or, something snarky or whatever, and I really don't want to do that. I don't want to put myself in that position.
But once again, isn't that the fear of rejection?
It is. It is. And I'm thinking, on the day of Pentecost, okay, before the Holy Spirit came down on the 12, how were they thinking? Before the Spirit came upon them, what were they doing? Huddling in a room. They weren't excited. They weren't thrilled. They still did not understand, did they? Even then, they still didn't understand until He sent the power of the Holy Spirit. And then what does Peter do? He stands up and preaches to the multitude of people and tells them what they've done. Now, do you think he was maybe in his right mind would have probably said, I don't want to do this because these are the same people that crucified Christ and they may just turn on me. But he had what? The power of the Holy Spirit. And that's what gave him the boldness to preach it confidently, with power. And what happened? Many were brought to Christ. Paul, how many times do you think that he was probably questioning, what am I doing? I could be out running around free if I didn't profess to be a Christian and push this Jesus Christ on these people all the time. If he would have continued to be what he was before, killing Christians, he was fine with that, wasn't he? In the beginning, he was fine with it. Everything was good until he was shown the truth. He wouldn't have had any persecution. Jews had been all for him. Yep, go for it. Get some more of them. Hibby.
Yeah, Acts chapter 6, it says, now in the days when the numbers of the disciples were multiplying, there rose a great murmuring. Scholars said there's about 20,000 people there. You go down to verse 7, and a bunch of the priests, and it said there were over 10,000 priests in Jerusalem at that time. Let's see what the number. The disciples multiplied in Jerusalem, and a great amount of priests were obedient to the faith. So you're already in, by the time in the 6th chapter, you got thousands of people.
Mm-hmm.
So
Small seed,
we'll see.
it explodes. I don't think we truly know how effective the word is. I don't think we really truly know how effective it is. Because we're talking a new belief that is being established, and look how fast it has grown. It could be the same here. It could be the same here. It could be anywhere. If it is brought forth with the same power that they had, why couldn't it grow? Jill.
Kind of interesting where Huey's at. We go to 9 and 10, he talks about some men from the synagogue of the freedmen, so on and so forth. Not, do you think all the ones before that obeyed the word? And then in 10 it said that they were unable to cope with the wisdom and the spirit with which he was speaking. This is talking about Stephen. So you have all those numbers, but then there's some that just, like I thought it was kind of like the way it said it, unable to cope with the wisdom and the spirit with which he was speaking. So there are going to be some, and we know what happened with Stephen. They stoned him.
Oh yeah. Mm-hmm.
And that's for Paul, So it's interesting when you think, was Paul in that group?
At the stoning of Stephen?
Well, no, wasn't able to cope with the wisdom and the. Was he in that group, Hughie? In that, what I was talking about right there?
Are you,
In Acts.
where are you at exactly?
In 9 and 10.
Acts verse 9 and 10, or what chapter are you talking to?
Chapter 6, where Hughie is at.
6, 9, and 10?
Yeah. I'm just asking a question because that was Stephen, full of grace and power, and performing great wonders and signs among the people.
Mm-hmm.
But they were unable to cope with what was happening there. And I was trying to think but he wouldn't have been in that group with you, Hughie. Probably not, because he was a Pharisee, right?
I think Saul was at the stoning of Stephen, wasn't he?
He was, but
Yeah.
this is before.
Yeah, he was holding the coat
Mm-hmm.
of Stephen. He was a young man.
Right.
So we have to think that he was, I know he was there at the stoning, but in this incident.
Where he was seized, is that where you're talking about?
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Well, if they dragged him away and brought him before the council.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he probably was. So he had a lot to think back on. And I think that's what gave him such
Paul did.
drive.
Exactly.
Yeah, Paul. He had so much to think back on, and I think that's what gave him such drive.
And really,
Because someone could have said, oh, he's not going to ever become a Christian.
exactly, exactly. Especially when he started killing Christians. He said, there's no way. I mean, Ananias was not really too hepped on going in and talking with him, was he?
That's like talking to Hitler.
Exactly. I mean, he said, what, you want me to go in and talk to him? You know what he's done?
Exterminate his Christians.
He's killing us. Why would you want me to go in there and... But that's the amazing thing about it.
Yeah, because then Stephen went into his defense, and then all along, and then in 8, Saul was in party agreement with putting him to death.
Right.
So he heard all that. Wow.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing, but when we look at ourselves, don't we have quite a bit to look back upon and say, we need to do our part to make sure that everybody else has an opportunity to have the chance that we did? I mean, granted, yeah, there's probably not too many of us that were in the same position as Paul, that we were killing Christians or anything like that, but we all had former lives before Christians. And if we believe what the Bible says, we were lost. And we can take that to heart, that people that do not understand the consequences of not coming to Christ, not obeying Him, the consequences are dire. And we know that. And that should give us even more drive to go out and teach others. And as Roger pointed out, it's showing. It's a small beginning, but look at the tremendous growth that happens. Same thing with the leaven. One of the interesting things, and I was talking with Glenn Sunday, I think it was. One of the interesting things about leaven or yeast is that it's everywhere. Remember when they would want you to clean the house of leaven, you swept the house. You didn't just take the jar of yeast or your pot of dough or sourdough starter or whatever. You didn't get rid of that. You swept the house clean. Because if you take flour and water and put it on the counter in your kitchen, it will make a starter of what is going on inside your house. The yeast that's natural in the air will start a starter. It's very, how would you say, as it says here, she put it in three portions of flour, I think, or meal, they said, or they had different, satan, I think it was, or something that they called it, satas, probably about a half a bushel. She put that leaven in three lumps. And what happened? It leavened the whole thing. Just a little bit in each one will leaven the whole thing. And that's the way our sourdough starters are. We have a starter. We put a little bit of that in our flour and our water. And what happens? Next thing you know, it's going over the top of the bowl. Because it's influencing what we put it in. And then we just feed the starter a little bit. Next time we want to make bread or pancakes, take a little bit of that out and put in there. Once again, it influences it. The yeast spreads. Isn't that the same thing that it basically talks about? Like the seed? What kind of influence do we have when we're around people?
Either good or bad.
It's good or bad. Now, most of the time when leaven is talked about in the Bible, what is it talked about as? Being bad. Sin. You know, I mean, they talk about the where was it? It was where the disciples were, where is that here? It was kind of comical that the disciples were talking about we forgot the bread, and Jesus' first comment to them was, watch out for the leaven of the Pharisees. And they didn't understand what he was talking about. They thought, he's talking about the bread. We didn't bring the bread. He's talking about it. But in the end, they said, oh, now we get it. We're not talking about bread. We're talking about the influence of the Pharisees. Now, in this case, it could be for the good, couldn't it? Couldn't our influence be for good? It could be for bad, but it should be for good. And as it says, if we influence a little bit, what's going to happen with it? It's going to grow, isn't it? Joe?
When you compare where this started compared to where it's all over the world now,
Mm-hmm.
that's big.
Yep. I mean, yes.
Because it has spread
Mhm.
all over the world. It's all over the world.
Mhm.
This message, Christians,
The, where was it at was it Colossians or Corinthians? Let's see. Where it basically said that it has spread to every corner of the earth. That's pretty big, isn't it? When you have something start in one small city and then it spreads to every corner of the earth. Has anything else done that? Nothing. Nothing. And we're a part of that. We're a part of that. We can claim a part of being part of the branch of that mustard plant because it is carried from there clear on through now. Is it going to stop here? Is the end of that branch going to just die right there? Or is it going to continue on? Because that's what he wants it to do, is to continue to grow. Sometimes I get discouraged when it says there's only going to be a few that make it. And I get discouraged. I'm thinking, well, there's going to be a lot that's not going to make it. And am I going to make a difference? Am I going to make an influence? Am I going to be able to make one less not go the wide gate? Is it worthwhile to do? Everyone that is going to be a part of the kingdom is relying on someone to tell them. Everyone that is going to be a part of the kingdom is relying on someone to tell them. Correct? What's the first thing in the plan of salvation? You must what? The word? You must hear it. If no one hears the word from now on, how is that plant going to grow? It's not. There's not going to be no more branches made. But we have to hear. And that relies upon us. In order for us to to present the word to those that need to hear it. Because bottom line, that's how it started, wasn't it? Peter gave the first sermon. We can't let it end with us. When we make an influence, a lot of it is like the salt, where it talks about the salt in Matthew 5:13. We're described as salt. When you have a piece of meat that you're putting on the grill, and you grill it and everything, and you put no salt on it, how does it taste? Bland. No. What does salt do?
Enhances the flavor.
It enhances it. It influences it. It makes it better, doesn't it? That's what he calls us. He calls us the salt. Do we make a difference? Joe.
I think if like you go back to the talents, you know, it's, each one had a certain responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
He gave more to some, less, less to others. So I think that you have to use that God-given gift.
Yep.
You need to in the service of God. And it's also kind of a reminder, because it's a reminder that Jesus is coming back and we have some work to do.
Right.
So we have to, no matter what you think, you may think is small, it's not.
Mm-hmm.
We all have different talents and different gifts.
Right.
And it's-
But we need to utilize them.
You need to utilize them.
Right. Right. Matthew 5:13 says, "You are the salt of the earth. But if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It's no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled by men." If we are not going to be the salt, what good is it? Andrew.
The salt's only good when it's added to other things. You ever take a spoonful of just salt?
Oh yeah, yeah.
It's not
It's
that great.
right.
It needs to be mixed with the rest of the world.
Exactly.
You know,
Exactly.
if you, in that analogy,
Mhm.
we have to be here to season
Mhm.
the rest of the world.
Right.
And try to teach them, be the light, but be, in this
Right.
example, be the salt, but not just by yourself.
No. And that's not what he meant. I mean, in everything that you read in here, does he say become a Christian and then just go to your house and hole up? Just be there. Just be my faithful servant in the house. He doesn't say that, does he? Once again, he says go out. Be an influence. Go out and be the salt of the earth. Go out and tell people. Convince them. What you have is what they need. Is it worth it? I mean, as Gene mentioned, sometimes we think, I don't want to be rejected. I don't know if it's worth it or not. It's worth it. It's worth it. We have a multitude of examples in here of people that were rejected. They were thrown in prison. They were persecuted. They were crucified. You name it. And if you ask them, was it worth it? I'll guarantee you what their answer would be. They would have said absolutely. Roger.
Well, if you look at the world today, they want to take away that influence. They don't want you to pray at the football game.
Exactly.
They throw all this stuff and they try to block your
Mhm.
influence. So it's incredible.
It's-
That's why we're in such the shape we're in today.
Exactly. But think about that. How much influence they have taken away from us. The 10 Commandments on the courthouse lawn. Prayer in school. As you say, at games, that used to always be, you started the game with prayer. I know at rodeos still, they do start it with prayer. Lord, keep us cowboys safe. I mean, if you take that influence out, if you take that saltiness out, what's it say? It's worthless. Trample it underfoot. As Roger said, that's what they want to do. They want to take all of that influence out, because that influence is going to cause them to make a decision. Whether they understand fully what you say and become like us, a Christian, or they make the decision, nope, don't want anything to do with it. But here's the consequences. Andrew.
You mentioned earlier, several people have mentioned, we look at somebody and say, well, they're not going to listen anyway, or I don't want the rejection. What we need to do when we look at that individual, when we're trying to decide, do I say something or not, would I trade their soul so that I'm not rejected? Mm-hmm. Am I willing to trade their soul so I don't have embarrassment or persecution for speaking up? Mm-hmm. Because that's what we're doing. When we decide not to say something or not to talk to someone, we're saying my embarrassment is more valuable, or my lack of embarrassment is more valuable than your soul.
Than their soul. Mm-hmm.
That's what, we don't say that, we don't think through that process, and we probably wouldn't do it. But we need to think through that process when we're trying to decide, should I say something or not.
Because even from the cross, looking upon the people that crucified him, what did Jesus say? Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. Joe.
I'm really thankful that somebody said something to me. Mm-hmm. Because I was one of those people that thought I was like that wasn't worth talking to. Right. And it wasn't that I just accidentally stumbled in the door. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? Right. It's because somebody talked to me, and I'm thankful for that.
Mm-hmm. That's the one thing that we can count on. Think about every conversion that you have read about in the Bible. Every conversion, without exception, involved the teaching of men. Now, God may have put men, as the Ethiopian eunuch, He put Philip there for him. God did that. Peter, he was put there with Cornelius. God did that. But who done the teaching? The men did. The people did. And as I said before, no one can become a Christian until they what? Hear the word. It has to involve us telling the word. There's no other way it can. I mean, we can hand out as many Bibles as we want. But they can just take it and look at that. Nice cover. Yeah. So? But when we open it up and we look at this and we teach this, then what happens to it? It's not a dead book anymore, is it? It's a living book. It's living words. But that has to be done by us. It's not one of those miraculous things because I hold the Bible, it just immediately instills in me all the words of goodness and grace. It has to be relayed by us. And just as Jesus did with the parables relating to people, we all have, as Joe said, we have gifts, talents. We all have certain things that are going to be understood by different people. Jill has a way of talking with people that she has no clue who they are. But she gets to know them, and in 15, 20 minutes, she's already figured out their whole history and figured out how they came from salmon, the origin of the world, I think, it seems like, because everybody came from salmon. But But she has a way of doing that. Each one of us has a way of doing things that can relate to people, just as Jesus did with these parables. He related to people that were needing influence. Now, granted, as we looked at some of the parables, some of them were not going to listen at all. They didn't understand the parable. There was a reason for that. But those with open hearts can be influenced by us talking to them.
Well, it's like Lyle, Mary Lou, they're at a bookstore.
Plaster, Mary Lou Plaster. Mhm.
And he invited her to church. Okay, so he took that one talent
Mhm.
and used it, right? And if it's just one person,
Mhm.
but then that was then Gary,
Yep.
I mean, you can see how that all, and Lyle just had a conversation with her,
Right?
and she came.
And some people have that ability, I think, more than others. Lyle's a talker, just like Jill. I mean, he's a talker. He gets into people's lives, and he's interested. He shows interest. That's what brings people out. That's what opens people up. Now, granted, some of them are going to shut down and say, you know what, my life's my own, get out of my face. That's unfortunate. Because they don't know what we're trying to hand them. They don't know what we have that is so valuable. But yet, does that mean that we quit? I mean, it's discouraging. Especially when it's friends, family, people close to you. When you present it, and they say, I don't want anything to do with that. That's hard to take, isn't it? And then to realize, in the end, if they don't change, where they're going. What is their hope? It's not the same as mine.
Their hope is that there's no heaven or there's no hell.
Well, yeah. But unfortunately, we know that there is
Yeah.
a heaven and a hell. And the choice is ours. I'm glad that someone, namely her, told me. Because honestly, the first 28 years of my life, 27 years of my life, I was okay. I didn't go out and steal, murder. I was a good guy. I worked hard. I was okay. I felt like I was going to make it to heaven, just on my morals. Until it was pointed out to me that in this word, that's not how you get to heaven. It's not just being good. It's being obedient. And that's the difference. There's a lot of people out there right now that are being good. And they think that's going to get them in the gate. But it's not. The only way to come in contact with the blood that is going to keep us out of hell is to be in contact with Christ. And the only way we can do that is being baptized into His body. I'm going to leave that with you tonight. Hopefully we can be an influence. Hopefully we can continue to be the salt of the earth.